The first time Lydia and Mark saw the old manor on the outskirts of town, they couldn't believe their luck. It was massive, Victorian, and exuded an eerie charm that drew them in instantly. It was much cheaper than the other homes they had been considering, and though it needed some work, they were excited about the possibilities. It was their dream home, or so they thought. The townspeople had warned them, of course. They spoke in hushed tones about the house, calling it cursed or haunted. Some claimed it had been abandoned for years for a reason, but Lydia and Mark dismissed these as mere superstitions. After all, every small town had its ghost stories, and this one felt no different. The first few days were uneventful. They unpacked boxes, started minor renovations, and laughed at the creaks and groans of the old wooden floors. But there was something about the house that felt off. Lydia couldn't quite put her finger on it at first. It wasn't the noises. Those could be explained away by the age of the home. It was the way the shadows seemed to linger longer than they should, and the way the air felt cold even when the sun shone through the windows. One evening while they were having dinner, Lydia noticed it for the first time. Out of the corner of her eye, she saw a dark figure standing in the doorway to the kitchen. Her breath caught in her throat, but when she turned to look directly, it was gone. "What's wrong?" Mark asked, noticing her sudden stillness. "I thought I saw something," Lydia replied, trying to shake it off. "Just a shadow, I guess." Mark smiled. "This place has plenty of those. Don't let it spook you." Lydia laughed, but the feeling lingered. Something wasn't right about the house. As the weeks went by, the strange occurrences became more frequent. Lydia began to see the shadowy figure in various parts of the house, always just out of the corner of her eye, always gone when she tried to focus on it. It was never clear, never fully formed, but its presence was undeniable. Mark, however, remained skeptical. He chalked it up to stress and the fatigue of renovating the house. "You're just tired," he would say whenever Lydia mentioned the shadow. "This place is old. It's probably just your imagination." But Lydia knew better. The house felt different, darker, and she was beginning to wonder if the townspeople's stories had been more than just rumors. One night, as they lay in bed, Lydia awoke to the sound of soft whispers. At first, she thought it was Mark talking in his sleep, but when she turned to him, he was sound asleep. The whispers grew louder, coming from somewhere in the house. They weren't in English, but they were insistent, as if trying to communicate something to her. She nudged Mark awake. "Do you hear that?" He groggily sat up, listening. The whispers had stopped. "Hear what?" he asked, rubbing his eyes. "The whispers, they were talking." Mark sighed. "Lydia, there's no one here but us. You're letting this house get to you." Lydia tried to calm herself down, but the feeling of unease persisted. She could feel the house watching her, waiting. One day, while cleaning out the attic, Lydia stumbled upon something strange. Hidden beneath a pile of old furniture and dusty boxes was a small wooden chest. It was locked, but the key was still in the lock, as if it had been forgotten. Curiosity piqued, Lydia opened the chest. Inside, she found an assortment of old letters, yellowed with age, and a diary. The entries in the diary were dated back nearly 100 years. It had belonged to a woman named Eleanor, who had lived in the manor long before it had been abandoned. As Lydia read through the entries, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. Eleanor wrote about seeing dark figures in the house, shadowy presences that followed her from room to room. She described feeling watched, the same way Lydia had, and hearing whispers in the night. But what frightened Lydia the most was the way the diary ended abruptly. The final entry was written in a shaky hand. "The darkness is growing stronger. I fear I may not be alone in this house much longer." Lydia's hands trembled as she closed the diary. She realized, with a sickening certainty, that whatever had haunted Eleanor was still in the house, and it was now focused on her. After reading the diary, Lydia's unease turned to outright fear. The shadowy figure she had been seeing out of the corner of her eye no longer seemed benign. It felt like a predator, waiting to strike. That night, as she lay in bed, she felt it again. The cold, oppressive presence in the room. She kept her eyes shut tight, too afraid to look, but she could feel the weight of the shadow watching her. It was closer now, almost as if it were standing right next to the bed. Suddenly, the bed creaked, and the room seemed to grow colder. Lydia's heart raced, and she held her breath, praying that whatever it was would leave. But the weight of the presence grew heavier, and she felt something tug at the blanket. "Mark," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Mark, wake up." Mark stirred but didn't fully wake. Lydia's voice grew more urgent. "Mark, something's in the room." He sat up groggily, looking around. "What are you talking about?" Before Lydia could respond, the door to their bedroom slammed shut with a force that shook the walls. Both of them jumped, wide awake now. Mark quickly turned on the light, but the room was empty. The fear in Lydia's eyes told him everything. He couldn't deny it anymore. Something was wrong with the house. Desperate for answers, Lydia and Mark decided to investigate the history of the house. They went to the town's library and spoke with some of the older residents. What they learned was more disturbing than they had anticipated. The manor had a long, dark history. It had once belonged to a wealthy family, but tragedy had struck. The eldest daughter, Eleanor, the same woman whose diary Lydia had found, had become obsessed with the occult. She believed that the house was a gateway to another realm, a place where spirits could cross into the living world. She had performed rituals trying to summon something from beyond. No one knew exactly what had happened, but after Eleanor's disappearance, the house had been abandoned. People claimed that the manor was cursed, that whatever Eleanor had summoned was still there, waiting for the next occupant. Lydia and Mark were horrified. The shadowy figure Lydia had been seeing, the whispers, the slamming doors, it all made sense now. They were dealing with something far more sinister than a mere haunting. The entity that Eleanor had summoned had latched onto Lydia, and it wasn't going to leave easily. With the knowledge of the house's dark past, Lydia and Mark knew they couldn't stay any longer. But they also knew they couldn't just leave without confronting the entity. They had to find a way to banish it once and for all. They contacted a spiritual medium, someone who specialized in dealing with malevolent entities. The medium agreed to come to the house, but warned them that the entity was powerful and would not go quietly. On the night of the cleansing ritual, the house felt more oppressive than ever. The air was thick with a malevolent energy, and the temperature had dropped to an icy cold. The medium began the ritual, chanting in a language that Lydia and Mark didn't understand. As the chanting grew louder, the house began to shake. The shadowy figure appeared in the corners of the room, flickering in and out of existence. It was angry. Suddenly, the lights went out, plunging the room into darkness. Lydia clutched Mark's hand, her heart racing. The medium continued the ritual, her voice unwavering, even as the entity began to lash out. Objects flew off the shelves, smashing against the walls. The door to the bedroom slammed open and shut, and the shadow grew larger, more defined. It seemed to pulse with anger, moving closer to them with every passing second. But the medium didn't stop. She raised her voice, commanding the entity to leave, to return to the darkness from which it came. The air crackled with energy as the shadow loomed over them, but just as it seemed it would engulf them, it vanished with a final, deafening roar. The house fell silent. The oppressive weight lifted, and for the first time in weeks, Lydia felt like she could breathe again. The medium turned to them, exhausted but victorious. "It's over," she said. "The entity is gone." Lydia and Mark sold the house shortly after. They didn't want to risk anything coming back. As they drove away from the manor for the last time, Lydia couldn't help but glance back at the shadowy figure she had seen for weeks. But this time there was nothing there, just the old abandoned house standing silently on the hill. It was supposed to be the perfect escape from the chaos of city life. Sophie and James had finally found their dream home, a large historic house on the edge of a quiet, rural town. The Victorian structure had stood the test of time, with its elegant architecture, high ceilings, and sprawling garden. It felt like a house with a history, one that had seen generations pass through its doors. But the history of the house was something they knew very little about. From the moment they stepped inside, Sophie felt a strange sense of déjà vu, as if she had been there before. The air inside the house was still, almost heavy, and the walls seemed to hold secrets. Sophie convinced herself that it was just the old house's charm, the kind of unsettling beauty that came with age. The first few weeks were spent unpacking and settling in. Sophie found herself falling in love with the house's unique character. James, ever the handyman, was busy fixing up the little details that needed work. But as the days turned into weeks, small, unexplainable things began happening. At first, it was minor. A door would be open when Sophie knew she had closed it, or she'd hear a faint knocking sound coming from the walls late at night. She brushed it off, assuming it was just the old house settling. But as time went on, the occurrences became harder to ignore. One night, as they lay in bed, Sophie was jolted awake by a strange sound. Whispers, soft and indistinct, coming from the walls. Sophie lay still in bed, her heart pounding in her chest. The whispers were faint but persistent, almost as if there were people having a conversation just behind the wall. She strained her ears to make out the words, but they were too muffled, too fragmented to understand. "James, wake up," she whispered, nudging her husband. James groaned, half asleep. "What is it? Do you hear that?" Sophie asked, her voice trembling. James listened for a moment, his brow furrowed. "It's probably just the wind," he mumbled, rolling over. But Sophie knew it wasn't the wind. The whispers continued, growing louder and more urgent, as if whoever, or whatever, was behind the walls wanted to be heard. The next morning, Sophie couldn't shake the eerie feeling that had settled over her. She tried to explain the whispers to James, but he dismissed it, saying it was probably just the old pipes or the house settling. But Sophie wasn't convinced. Later that day, while James was at work, Sophie decided to investigate. She walked through the house, pausing at each room, pressing her ear against the walls, listening for the whispers. But the house was silent. It wasn't until she reached the attic that she heard it again. A faint, almost imperceptible whisper, like a breeze rustling through leaves. It sent a chill down her spine. She pushed open the door to the attic, and a rush of cold air greeted her. The attic was dark, filled with old furniture and boxes left behind by the previous owners. Sophie's heart raced as she stepped inside, the floorboards creaking under her weight. The whispering grew louder, more distinct. It was coming from the far corner of the attic, behind an old, dusty wardrobe. With trembling hands, Sophie moved the wardrobe aside, revealing a small hidden door in the wall. It was locked. Sophie stared at the small door, her mind racing. Why would there be a hidden door in the attic? And what was behind it? Her curiosity got the best of her. She spent the next few days trying to find a key, searching through old drawers and forgotten boxes. But there was no key to be found. The door remained locked, and the whispers continued to plague her at night. One evening, Sophie finally worked up the courage to ask James about the door. "Have you seen the door in the attic?" she asked casually, hoping not to sound too paranoid. James raised an eyebrow. "What door?" "The one behind the wardrobe," Sophie said. "It's locked." "Do you think the previous owners left something behind?" James shrugged. "Maybe, but if it's locked, there's probably a reason for it. We shouldn't mess with it." But Sophie couldn't let it go. The whispers had grown louder, more insistent, as if whatever was behind the door was desperate to be let out. She began having nightmares. Dark, vivid dreams of people trapped inside the walls, crying out for help. In one dream, she saw a woman standing in the attic, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes hollow. The woman was whispering something, but Sophie couldn't make out the words. When she woke up, her heart was racing, and she felt an overwhelming sense of dread. She knew she had to open the door. Determined to find out what was behind the door, Sophie went to the town's historical society to see if she could find any information about the house. What she discovered left her shaken. The house had been built in the late 1800s by a wealthy family. According to old records, the family had 2 children, a boy and a girl. But tragedy struck when the boy mysteriously disappeared one night, and the family was never the same. The mother, driven mad with grief, claimed that she could hear her son's voice in the walls, calling out to her. She became obsessed with the idea that he was still alive, trapped somewhere in the house. Sophie's blood ran cold as she read through the old newspaper clippings. The mother had spent years tearing the house apart, searching for her son, but he was never found. Eventually, she was committed to an asylum, and the house was sold. Sophie couldn't shake the feeling that the whispers she had been hearing were connected to the boy's disappearance. She was convinced that whatever had happened all those years ago was somehow tied to the locked door in the attic. That night, as she lay in bed, the whispers returned, louder than ever. Sophie knew she couldn't ignore them any longer. She had to open the door. Sophie couldn't wait any longer. While James was at work, she decided to break the lock on the attic door. Armed with a crowbar, she made her way up to the attic, her heart pounding in her chest. The whispers were louder now, almost as if they were urging her on. With shaking hands, she pried open the lock. The door creaked open, revealing a small, dark room. The air inside was stale, as if it had been sealed off for years. Sophie hesitated for a moment, her heart racing, before stepping inside. The room was empty save for a single old wooden chest in the corner. Dust covered every surface, and the air was thick with the scent of decay. Sophie slowly approached the chest, her breath coming in short, shallow gasps. She knelt down and opened the chest. Inside were old clothes, toys, and a small leather-bound journal. Sophie carefully picked up the journal and opened it. The pages were yellowed with age, the handwriting faded but still legible. The journal belonged to the missing boy. As Sophie read through the journal, a horrifying story began to unfold. The boy, whose name was Edward, had been locked away in the attic by his parents, who believed he was possessed. They had kept him hidden from the world, refusing to let anyone know about their cursed child. Edward had spent years trapped in the small room, his only solace the journal he had kept. The final entry was chilling. It described how Edward had tried to escape, but his parents had caught him. The last sentence was scrawled in large, frantic letters. "They are coming for me." Sophie's hands trembled as she closed the journal. The whispers in the walls, the voices she had been hearing, they were Edward's. His spirit had been trapped in the house for over a century, calling out for help. Suddenly, the room grew cold. Sophie felt a presence behind her, and when she turned around, she saw the figure of a young boy standing in the doorway. His eyes were hollow, his face gaunt and pale. "Help me," he whispered. Sophie screamed. Emily and Jack had been yearning for a simpler life, far from the noise and bustle of the city. When they stumbled upon Willow Creek, a charming and isolated town nestled in the countryside, it seemed like the perfect place to start fresh. The house they found was a beautiful old farmhouse standing proudly on a hill overlooking acres of farmland. It was larger than they needed, but felt like a place where they could grow, maybe even start a family. The previous owners had left in a hurry, but that didn't bother Emily or Jack. People had their reasons for moving quickly, and it wasn't their place to pry. The house had a few quirks, like the creaky wooden floors and the occasional draft. But that was to be expected from a home that had stood for more than 100 years. After signing the papers, they moved in immediately. The first night in Willow Creek was quiet, almost too quiet for their city-trained ears. But as they settled into bed, the stillness felt peaceful, a welcome change from the sirens and car horns they were used to. Emily drifted off to sleep quickly, but her dreams were strange that night. She dreamt of a woman standing at the edge of the bed, watching her with cold, hollow eyes. The woman didn't say anything. She just stared. Emily woke with a start, her heart racing. But the room was empty, and Jack slept peacefully beside her. "It's just nerves," she told herself. Moving into a new home could be stressful, and it was probably just her mind playing tricks on her. But as the days passed, Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. There was a heaviness in the air, an oppressive weight that seemed to settle over the house as soon as the sun went down. And then there were the noises. Soft, almost imperceptible at first, like footsteps in the hall outside their bedroom. At first, Emily tried to ignore the strange noises. The farmhouse was old, and old houses made noises. But as the days passed, the sounds became harder to dismiss. The soft creaks of the floorboards at night started to sound more deliberate, like someone walking down the hall. The faint knocking on the walls became more rhythmic, almost like someone was trying to get their attention. One night, as Emily lay in bed trying to sleep, she heard it again. Footsteps outside the bedroom door. She froze, her breath catching in her throat. The steps were slow and measured, like someone pacing back and forth. She nudged Jack awake, her heart pounding. "Do you hear that?" she whispered. Jack listened for a moment, but the footsteps had stopped. He sighed, half asleep. "It's probably just the house settling," he muttered before rolling over and falling back to sleep. But Emily wasn't convinced. The footsteps had sounded too real, too close. The next morning, she searched the house looking for anything that might explain the noises, but everything seemed normal. Still, the uneasy feeling lingered. It wasn't just the sounds. It was the sense that they were being watched, that something in the house was aware of them. Things escalated a few nights later. Emily was alone in the house. Jack had gone into town for some supplies, and she was sitting in the living room, reading a book, when she heard it again. The footsteps. This time, they were louder, more distinct. They were coming from upstairs. Her pulse quickened. She set her book down and stood, listening intently. The footsteps stopped, then started again, this time heading toward the stairs. Emily's throat went dry. She grabbed her phone, her hands trembling, and dialed Jack. "Jack, I'm hearing things again," she whispered, her voice shaking. Footsteps upstairs. Jack tried to reassure her. "It's an old house, Em. I'll be home soon, okay? Just stay calm." But as she hung up the phone, the footsteps started again. This time they were coming down the stairs. Emily's heart raced as she stood frozen at the bottom of the staircase. The footsteps had stopped, but the air felt thick with tension. She wanted to run out of the house, but something held her there, some deep-seated need to know what was happening. She decided to check upstairs. Taking slow, deliberate steps, she ascended the staircase, every creak of the wooden stairs making her nerves flare. The hallway at the top of the stairs was dark, illuminated only by the soft glow of the moonlight filtering through the windows. There were 3 doors along the hallway, 2 bedrooms, and a small room at the end that they hadn't used yet. It was the door to the small room that caught her attention. It had always been locked, and neither she nor Jack had ever been able to find a key. But now, as she stood there, she noticed something strange. The door was slightly ajar. Emily's stomach churned with fear. She had checked that door before, and it had always been locked tight. How could it be open now? Gathering her courage, she walked down the hallway and pushed the door open. The room was dark and empty, but the air inside was freezing cold. Her breath came out in a visible mist as she stepped inside. The room was small, with nothing in it but a single old rocking chair in the corner. But as she looked closer, she noticed something else. On the floor, etched into the wooden planks, were strange symbols, carved deeply into the wood as if by a knife. The markings were unlike anything she had ever seen, and they filled her with an overwhelming sense of dread. She backed out of the room quickly, slamming the door behind her. She didn't know what those symbols meant, but she was certain they weren't a good sign. Emily couldn't sleep that night. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing with questions. What were the symbols in the locked room? Why had the door suddenly opened? And more disturbingly, who or what had been walking around the house at night? The next day, she tried to talk to Jack about it, but he was skeptical. "You're letting your imagination get the best of you," he said. "This house is old. It's bound to have some quirks." But Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong. The house didn't feel like a home anymore. It felt like a prison. And whatever was inside it didn't want them there. That night, things took a darker turn. Emily woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of the rocking chair in the locked room creaking back and forth. The sound was faint but unmistakable. Her blood ran cold. She nudged Jack, her voice trembling. "Jack, do you hear that?" He groggily sat up and listened. The creaking continued, rhythmic and steady, as if someone, or something, was sitting in the rocking chair, swaying back and forth. Jack's eyes widened. What the hell? They both got out of bed and slowly made their way down the hallway to the locked room. The door was ajar again. Jack pushed it open, and there, in the moonlit room, the rocking chair was moving on its own. They both stood frozen in the doorway, unable to move, as the chair creaked back and forth, back and forth. Suddenly, the chair stopped. Then, without warning, the door slammed shut in their faces. Terrified, Jack and Emily retreated to their bedroom and locked the door. Neither of them could explain what they had just seen. The next morning, Jack suggested they call a professional, someone who could help them understand what was happening. They contacted a local historian who specialized in the area's history, and what they learned left them shaken. The farmhouse had once belonged to a family in the late 1800s, much like many other houses in the area. But unlike other homes, this one had a dark history. The previous owners had been deeply involved in occult practices, and the room that had been locked was used for rituals. The strange symbols carved into the floor were protective sigils, meant to keep something from escaping. What were they trying to keep inside? Emily asked, her voice trembling. The historian looked at them gravely. A spirit, a malevolent one, from what I've gathered. The family that lived here believed they had summoned something dark, and they tried to contain it. But it was too late. Jack and Emily were horrified. The footsteps, the noises, the rocking chair, it all made sense now. The spirit of whatever had been summoned all those years ago was still in the house, and it had been growing stronger since they had moved in. Determined to free themselves from the malevolent presence, Jack and Emily decided to leave the house, but they knew they couldn't just walk away. They had to do something to stop whatever was inside from following them, or worse, hurting someone else. They reached out to a local priest who had experience with exorcisms and asked him to come to the house. The priest agreed, but he warned them that the spirit they were dealing with was dangerous. On the day of the exorcism, the house was eerily quiet. The air was thick with tension as the priest prepared the room for the ritual. Emily and Jack watched nervously as the priest began his prayers, walking through the house with holy water and a crucifix. As the priest entered the locked room, the temperature dropped drastically. The rocking chair began to move on its own, slowly at first, then faster and faster. The lights flickered and a low, guttural growl echoed through the house. The priest stood firm, continuing his prayers even as the house seemed to tremble around them. The growling grew louder, and suddenly, the door to the room slammed shut with a deafening bang. But the priest didn't stop. He continued the exorcism, his voice growing stronger with each word. After what felt like an eternity, the growling ceased. The room went still. The door slowly creaked open, and the priest emerged, looking exhausted but victorious. The house was quiet after the exorcism. The heavy, oppressive feeling that had hung in the air was gone, and the strange noises ceased. Jack and Emily finally felt like they could breathe again. They sold the house shortly after, not wanting to take any chances. The new owners never reported anything unusual, and Jack and Emily were relieved to finally be free of the nightmare. But sometimes, late at night, Emily would think about the woman she had seen in her dream on their first night in the house. She wondered if the spirit had been watching them all along, waiting for the right moment to strike. She hoped they had left it behind in Willow Creek, but a part of her would always wonder if it had followed them, waiting for the right time to return.